What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 62, and I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Solo show today. I got a couple news stories to cover, but most of what I'm doing is a deeper dive into the Yemen war, specifically looking at the U.S. role in that war and why it needs to end. Today, January 25th, there's a call to action to demand that our governments exit that war, and so, to do my little part, I'm going to be talking about that, and again, specifically like why the U.S. got into that war and what we've done to essentially help Saudi Arabia commit genocide against the people of Yemen. So that's the show today. I think it's a good one I got set up here. Support the show, subscribestar.com. If you give $5 a month, I will let you into the private Discord channel. Share the show on YouTube. Subscribe if you're listening there and hit the like button. And then the show's also at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor. So check out that and my daily news roundup. Let's get into the couple of news stories I have here first. This one is pretty concerning. It looks like the occupation of Washington, D.C. by at least 5,000 U.S. troops is going to continue. The article here is from Politico titled Impeachment Trial to Keep National Guard Troops at Capitol. And then the subtitle is There Are Fear of Mass Demonstrations. So, I think this is pretty concerning that they would deploy National Guards troops to the Capitol in fear of mass demonstrations. I think if this had happened like under Trump, let's say during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings or something like that, where there were, protesters that went nowhere near as far as the Capitol riot protesters did, but they were going into the Senate, like the chambers and like banging on doors and generally like being disruptive and disrupting business. Again, not comparable to like what happened at the Capitol riot necessarily, but I think you could see that, mass demonstrations where people are disrupting Congress, it seems to be something. Is that something we really want to start deploying National Guard troops for? And that's essentially what we have here. The story starts: former President Donald Trump's upcoming Senate impeachment trial poses a security concern that federal law enforcement officials told Congress last week that requires up to as many as 5,000 National Guard troops to remain in Washington through mid-March. So from, the Congress perspective, I guess they could hear this from law enforcement and say, we hear you, but we have a country here with a rule of law, and, we don't deploy troops to our own country. That's just something that, we don't do. We handle protests, with the Capitol Police, and maybe that means sometimes members of Congress are a little more in a dangerous position, but, that's, I think it's supposed to be part of what this country is, that, Congress doesn't get to defend themselves with 5,000 troops. That, that's not what, we don't deploy troops on our own soil against American citizens, especially not in concern of mass demonstrations. That's concerning. There's, some National Guardsmen don't seem to be very happy with this. One quoted in the article says, "Quite frankly, this is not a combat zone, so combat conditions shouldn't apply." And, this guy's been deployed to Afghanistan a couple of times, and now he's deployed to D.C. DC is turning into Kabul a lot of ways. We're calling, green zones and red zones and thousands of troops. The other thing that I think should be considered here is that since the Capitol riots, Donald Trump has been pretty consistent with his supporters to, do things peacefully and not to stir up trouble and stuff like that. And the U.S. deployed 20-something thousand National Guardsmen to D.C. for the inauguration, and absolutely nothing happened. There is no need for them. And so I think, reflecting on everything that happened, the National Guardsmen need to, disperse from D.C. If the Capitol Police need to, prevent protests from getting out of hand, then maybe that's the role of the Capitol Police to the, extent that you have to, people extend from just regular protesting to rioting. But As we saw, they were able to, with a minimum of number of Capitol Police, prevent anything really terrible from happening in the Capitol on the 6th anyway. So it doesn't seem like the guardsmen are needed at all, and it's very unfortunate to see the occupation of DC continue. The next article I have here is from Common Dreams by Brett Wilkins, titled Rights Advocates Alarmed by U.S. Spy Agency's Purchase of Warrantless Phone Location Data. So what's happening here? And sorry for people looking on YouTube, the article isn't the greatest color scheme here, but there was a question asked by Ron Wyden and to the DIA, and I guess what he was basically asking them is there's a court hearing, Carpenter versus the United States, that says law enforcement agencies can't get cell phone location data without first obtaining a warrant, and yet it was possible, I guess, that the DIA was essentially just buying up this data from companies that sell it. And so I suppose like probably Facebook and all the other data collection companies and stuff, it's pretty common for them to sell your data to other groups, but there should be a big question mark around, can the government buy that? Because really they should only be able to obtain that data with a warrant. And so it appears that the DIA is now actually buying that information from tech companies. I have a couple concerns with this. The first is, what is the value of that data? How do we know that the DIA isn't overpaying for it? Because if the DIA is overpaying for it, especially by quite a bit, or if, the tech companies are making a ton of money off this, it would be a good way for the U.S. government to gain some leverage over these tech companies, right? If there is a situation where maybe the U.S. government would like some voices on a certain issue silenced, right? If Facebook, let's say, is worried about losing billions of dollars that comes from the data, the DIA says, well, if you don't take this guy off your platform, then we're not going to buy your data. That could be a pretty good way to, keep Facebook on the hook and make sure people are doing the bidding of the government. And so there's an issue there. There's also the obvious Fourth Amendment issue. That part is very troubling and very concerning. And then also that it's our tax dollars that are being used to spy on us. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting what our government is doing here. So this is a really important article. We reprinted it on antiwar.com. It's up there today. I definitely recommend people checking it out. And it looks like there's more revelations on this to come. We're just kind of finding out that the government is doing this. And so I think it will actually take a little bit of time before we understand the true extent of what's happening there. Another concerning part is that there's really not protections around what the DIA does with that data. What they say is that DIA personnel can access the data with permission of the Director of National Intelligence Chief. So I assume that'll be Avril Haines here in a couple weeks, who helped cover up the CIA spying on the Senate Intelligence Committee that was investigating the CIA's torture program, also helped to cover up the torture program, and helped Obama justify his drone program. And so that's not exactly the kind of person that seems interested in upholding rights. More, she looks for loopholes to exploit to be able to kill the people and harm the people that she believes are dangerous, even if they're not, or innocents are regularly wrapped up in that. All right, I think it's time to move on to this Yemen situation here. So I'm guessing that most of my audience knows generally where Yemen is and that there's been a war going on in Yemen since March of 2015. Although I don't think that's at all true of the general American population. I would guess that most people would still have trouble finding Yemen on a map, despite the fact that our country has been, again, a major player, if not the most significant player in that war for the past almost 6 years now. And that we really have no idea of anything. The general population of the U.S. has no idea of anything about that war other than it's a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the U.S. is generally on the Saudi side because we're against Iran. But we're going to get into actually what's happening here and not the 3 minute whatever narrative that you'll get on Fox or CNN about how this war has to continue and we have to support the Saudis and all that other crap. So to, I guess, start with, Yemen is located on the southeast or southwest corner of the Arabian Peninsula. It's actually located very close to Africa. I mean, it's just, I think, a couple dozen miles across the Al Bab Strait to get from like Djibouti or Eritrea into Yemen. And I've seen reports of refugees from Africa flowing into Yemen across that strait in fairly small boats. And so I guess it's not really a difficult piece of water to cross. Now, I assume that there's a lot of Saudi and U.S. warships and other tankers that roll through there pretty regularly. It's probably a pretty busy area of water. However, from my understanding, it's a pretty quick place to cross. And so, that's another interesting part of Yemen. It has this complicated land border with Saudi Arabia that I don't think is super well defined. And then also importantly, if you look off to the west coast of Saudi Arabia and Yemen, there's a lot of islands out there, and then I guess there are some oil interests out in the middle of the Red Sea over there. Yemen has some other untapped oil potential. I believe that's more in the northeast or the central part of the country. But yeah, that there's a lot of concern about the water territory boundaries between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, also the land boundaries, and then also some concerns over oil. But I think those are kind of secondary to the political situation in Yemen, which Saudi Arabia seems very interested in controlling. If we go back to 1990, I guess, Yemen officially becomes unified between North and South Yemen. South Yemen was a Soviet proxy state for a long time. And they unite under the rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh, and he rules the country from 1990 until 2000 and I guess 2011, 2012. During that time, Saleh received a lot of support from the United States, ostensibly to fight Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is regularly seen and assessed as the most dangerous jihadist or Al-Qaeda group in the world to the American people. They're very interested in plotting 9/11 style attacks in the United States. I believe they were the underwear bomber over DC, the guy that was going to blow up his underpants on an airplane and kill everybody and probably drop the plane and kill a bunch of people that way too, was an AQAP guy. However, just because the U.S. gave the dictator weapons to fight Al-Qaeda, and I'm sure, he did use some of those weapons to kill Al-Qaeda guys because they were likely an enemy of Saleh. He also used those weapons to fight this group in northern Yemen from a region, Sadr, which is north of the capital, Sana'a. And there are a group of Zaidi Shiites, and they are a part of and have become a group militia, kind of a ruling now political faction, al-Houthi. And so that's who Saleh pit some wars and fought wars against for several years. And that the Houthis, I guess, did a pretty good job of beating back Saleh's forces, even with the U.S. support. In 2010, 2011, the Arab Spring came to Yemen. This is a movement that first hit places like Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, that saw, either threatened or actual overthrow of longtime dictatorial rulers like Saleh in Yemen. Eventually, Saleh is targeted and actually pretty seriously injured to the point he has to flee the country in an attack. And when he leaves the country, the U.S. organizes, and this is Hillary Clinton's State Department, a one-man election where Saleh's former vice president, a man named Mansour Hadi, is installed as president. I believe Hadi's mandate was only supposed to last 2 years. So from 2012 to 2014, it's kind of to, set up a new election process so there could be democracy in Yemen. That's the original idea of what the U.S. was pushing there. What ends up happening is essentially Hadi turns into Saleh and pits a fight with the Houthis and essentially tries to rearrange Yemeni politics a little bit in a way, I shouldn't say a little bit, significantly in a way that was going to further marginalize the Houthi. For the Houthi, this was absolutely too much, and they quickly were able to dispose of the Hadi government's control of the capital city of Sana'a. One of the reasons that they were able to do this is they struck up an alliance with the former president Saleh. And, Yemen isn't the United States, where when Obama was president and left office, he turned over the commander-in-chief and the reins of control to Donald Trump. And, there wasn't a question. It's not like, the CENTCOM general who I think was Lloyd Austin, now Biden's Secretary of Defense. It's not like Lloyd Austin took all of his fighters and they were now Obama loyalists and, weren't going to do the bidding of Donald Trump. But that is what happened in Yemen, essentially, where large portions of the military defected and, teamed up with this Saleh-Hadi alliance that now existed. They quickly took control of the majority of the Yemen population and were in fact threatening to take, so Sana'a's the capital city, and it's located in, I don't know, I would guess central west Yemen, maybe a way to describe it for people who aren't looking at a map. And then if you go like straight south from there all the way down to where Yemen sits on the Gulf of Aden, but the body of water that turns into the Indian Ocean, you have the port city of Aden, which became the capital city of the Hadi government. And so once the Houthis and Salah were threatening the Hadi government in Aden, Saudi Arabia found this situation, or at least that's what they said, to be they couldn't tolerate it, right? It was intolerable for them. And so they decided that they wanted to start supporting the Hadi government. And, at this point in time, there's really not much left. The Hadi government has been, routed out of most of Yemen now. It has one real capital, one city left in Aden. But the Saudi Air Force being controlled and purchased from the United States and UK was pretty powerful. And so once they in March of 2015 decided to start backing the Hadi government, they were quickly able to stop the Houthi and Salah offensive against Aden. Now, I guess that's about all I have, and this is where the U.S. enters the war, right, on March 25th. One of the things that the U.S. is doing is supporting Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen by providing mid-air refueling, bombs and planes, and then the maintenance on those planes, intelligence and targeting assistance. They help enforce what they call Saudi's rules of like navigation off the coast of Yemen, but this is essentially just the blockade of Yemen. And they've, continued to provide Saudi Arabia with like diplomatic cover and support. So one of the things I want to look at with the Houthis here before we get into what happened in March of 2015, the start of the war and after. This is an article from the Wall Street Journal titled, "In Strategic Shift, U.S. Draws Closer to Yemeni Rebels." In subtitle, "Washington Steps Up Connection with Houthis to Promote Stable Political Transition Fight Against Al-Qaeda." And the important quote here in the article from a senior U.S. official: "We have to take pains not to end up inflaming the situation by inadvertently firing on Houthi fighters, a senior U.S. official said. They are not our military objectives. It's AQAP, and we have to stay focused on that. And so this is published in late January 2015, so just 2 months before the U.S. changes this completely and starts fighting against the Houthi. But we see here from this article that the U.S. was actually working with the Houthi to fight against AQAP up until 2015. And again, AQAP is this group of Sunni jihadists in Yemen that actually want to do some harm to Americans and have plotted and carried out, attacks towards the U.S., since 9/11 and stuff like that. And so if there is an issue, if there is a concern, it has to be with AQAP in Yemen. So it's then kind of confusing as to how the U.S. goes from this position in January to the other position in March. But we get that explanation in a New York Times article from 2016 titled "Quiet Support for Saudi Entangles U.S. and Yemen." And in the third paragraph of this article, we have, and this article isn't written as a expose. We caught the Obama government getting involved in this secret war. This was an article that was like the Obama administration talking about that war and explaining why they're in the war and what the U.S. is doing there. And so it says 2 days of discussion in the West Wing followed, but there was little real debate. Among other reasons, the White House needed to placate the Saudis as the administration completed a nuclear deal with Iran, Saudi Arabia's archenemy. That fact alone eclipsed concerns among many that the president's advisors that the Saudi-led offensive would be long, bloody, and indecisive. And so what they are saying is that the U.S. went from a position in Yemen where we were backing the Houthis and support and working with the Houthis to kill Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the enemies of the American people, because Obama was negotiating what was supposed to be a nuclear deal, a peace deal with Iran. That upset Saudi Arabia. And even though that deal was going to and should have placated the concerns of Saudi Arabia about Iran, because what the Saudis and the Israelis go on and on about is, oh, Iran's going to make a nuclear bomb, then they'll control the region, and it's going to be this big, horrible situation. The deal prevented Iran from developing a nuclear bomb. But from the Saudi perspective, what was happening is that if you took the Iranian nuclear bomb myth off the table with this deal, it would make it so that even the paranoids and the crazies couldn't convince people that Iran was a nuclear threat. If you took that off of the table, then there really wasn't a reason for the U.S. to hate the Iranians, and there isn't a reason for the U.S. to hate the Iranians, then there isn't as much of a reason for the U.S. to bat Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia, seeing that, said, oh no, we have to do something. And so for, I think, other reasons, like I said, there's the oil and stuff like that. There's also the guy who's now the Crown Prince of Yemen, Mohammed bin Salman, at the time had just been promoted to defense minister. And so he started this war. He named it Operation Decisive Storm. And I pretty sure that with that name, and he was like 30 years old at the time, what his plan was is that he was going to go in, he was going to kick the hell out of the Houthis, right? And then that was going to be a giant victory for him to propel him onto higher ranks in the Saudi royal family, because at the time it was his cousin Mohammed bin Nayef that was actually crown prince. He was only deputy crown prince, and so I think he was going to use the war to displace his cousin, which he's ultimately been able to do anyways. So yeah, to maintain the Iran enemy, the U.S. entered a war. So to do a peace deal with Iran, the U.S. started a war. That alone is absolutely Orwellian crazy that the Obama administration would do this. But it wasn't even really a sensible war, anything that had anything to do with the United States, and they knew that the offensive would be long, bloody, and indecisive. What does that mean? What does it mean to have a war that's long, bloody, and indecisive? That means 6 years later, there are at least 250,000 dead Yemenis. A lot of those people aren't dead from the war necessarily, but because they starved to death. That means little children are just not having the food they need and dropping dead. You see these pictures of kids that are 5, 6 years old and are like 12 pounds, right? They're like generally the size of like a 2 or 3 year old, except they have absolutely no meat on their bones whatsoever. You could see their bones and their ligaments and all, and regularly these kids are severely malnourished. When the news will report on these families and stuff like that, oftentimes what they find are that this is like the third child that the family is dealing with. That's that they have another child that's already starved to death. Right. This is the situation in Yemen, that the Obama administration entered a war that they knew that this was probably what was going to happen, the situation they have right now in Yemen. But they did it because he wanted to get the Iran nuclear deal done. Now, the Iran nuclear deal was important, but the worst and most disgusting part of all of this is that this war has outlived that nuclear deal now. And the Biden administration now seems far more concerned about, trying to get more out of Iran on the nuclear deal than even ending this war in Yemen. It's striking how cruel this whole policy has been. And so, that's why I think that the U.S. shouldn't be involved in the war at all in the first place. I mean, I think this, paragraph, again, from the New York Times article explains it best, that it's just about placating Saudi Arabia over a deal that we're not even in anymore. So there's a couple of events in the war that I specifically want to talk about. This one from October of 2016. U.S. made bomb used an airstrike on funeral in Yemen, Human Rights Watch says. There was this horrific incident that was actually caught on camera. This is one of the things that made me end up starting my first show, Foreign Policy Focus, was watching this video and seeing the cruelty. You could imagine whatever that the U.S. bombs people, but if you actually see a person at a funeral being bombed, that makes you want to do something. And so that's part of what made me start my first show. What happened, you had a funeral occurring in downtown Yemen on October 8th. So imagine you have a church in the middle of a city or something, you're having a funeral, and another country comes and drops a bomb on that funeral. But not just one bomb. As people are fleeing, they drop a second, a third, and I believe a fourth. It turns out that those bombs were made in the U.S., and I'm sure that the people who lost loved ones in that attack know where those bomb fragments came from. They probably know that it was an American-made plane that the Saudis flew over there and dropped. We have some pictures here of the destruction of that funeral building. Thousands of people were in attendance, by the way. So it could have been a whole lot worse. This was clearly a strike on a civilian target. The other thing is that I guess this funeral in Yemen was being used as I don't want to say like a cover or anything, but maybe as an excuse or a reason to have some talks between rival factions in Yemen. I'm not saying that this would have, been peace talks that ended the war or anything like that, but apparently this funeral was going to be used for talks. And I'm sure for the people of Yemen, that adds to the tragedy and the insult of the Saudi attack with U.S.-made weapons on their funeral. The next one, I should mention that this funeral bombing actually prompted the Obama administration to suspend some bomb sales to Saudi Arabia for like 2 months, and then the Trump administration restarted them. Rather than saying like, oh my God, we just supported the bombing of a funeral, we can't support the Saudi side of this war anymore and end it before Donald Trump takes office, this guy that everybody thought was just going to want to kill Muslims at will, right? They were concerned about this. This was a place where it could happen, and Obama just, let this thing go on, even though it was turning into the nightmare, the hell that his administration thought it would be. Even before that event in the war, there was a Saudi airstrike on a wedding that killed 130 people, and then that actually happened in October of 2015. And then a couple weeks later, they bombed another wedding and killed another 20 people. And so again, this just goes to show how cruel this war has really been against the people of Yemen. But the last one I have here is the worst, and this was in 2018. This was something that really didn't prompt any response from the United States, even though it was committed with U.S. weapons. And the title of the article here from the Guardian is U.S. supplied bombs that killed 40 children on Yemen school bus. And so what happened is August 9th of 2018, there was a field trip going on in Yemen. 40 kids were on a school bus, and Saudi Arabia bombed that school bus. Right? I mean, I don't know how much more of an act could be before it's clearly a terrorist act. They denied it and said it wasn't us, or that they were using it to transport bombs or something. But at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia decided to bomb a bus full of children with a U.S. made bomb, probably in a U.S. made plane, and we just continue supporting them. This didn't provoke Congress to try to end the war in Yemen. This didn't make them introduce a war powers resolution. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi did, an American or a Saudi journalist that lived in the United States, worked for the Washington Post, and he was brutally killed in the Istanbul consulate. And I don't blame members of Congress for wanting to withdraw or weaken their ties with Saudi Arabia because they killed and dismembered a journalist in the consulate. But it's absolutely appalling to me that the killing of 40 children on a school bus from ages 6 to 11, right? So little elementary school kids, if you look at the coffins of the funeral, they're all like little children-sized boxes. It's absolutely horrific. But that didn't provoke any kind of response. And the reason why is because that every single time this war is talked about in the mainstream media, is they say it's a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so look, it's terrible what's going on over there, but we have to support our side, the Saudis, because the Iranians, they say, are the biggest state sponsors of terrorism, and so that's the way that we have to do it. And that's really the excuse used every time for this. U.S. made weapons have been used far more in the war than just those attacks. There's a exclusive report from Saudi Arabia on this particular phenomenon titled "Made in America," and then the subtitle is "Shrapnel Found in Yemen Ties U.S. Bombs to String of Civilian Deaths Over a Course of Bloody Civil War." I think the whole phrase civil war is pretty inaccurate. While the Saudi side does back the Hadi government, which internationally, like if you go to the UN or something, I guess is the recognized government of Yemen. But for the past 6 years, the Houthis have controlled 70% of the Yemen's population and are essentially the government in that area. So I think it's far more accurate to say that the Houthis are the government of Yemen, and this Hadi Ba'ath force is essentially the Saudi Ba'ath rebellion, the Sunnis in Syria of Yemen. So yeah, this story goes through and does a whole lot more work than, I won't get into all these attacks, but they go back to 2016. Strike on home kills 1, injures 6. That's a U.S. made bomb. An airstrike hit a school in Yemen. That's a U.S. made bomb. Cluster bomb hits farmer's home, kills 10 civilians. U.S. made bomb. The list goes on and on and on here. And so this is actually some real good work from CNN on what the U.S. bombs have done to tear apart Yemen, and it does little to move the actual U.S. position or policy in Yemen, and even when they bother to report on it, it largely gets ignored by everyone. The other report from CNN I have on Yemen is titled "Lost to an Enemy," and it's about how U.S. weapons that were given to Saudi Arabia and the UAE have made their way into hardline Salafi militias and other factions waging war in Yemen. And this includes groups like AQAP and the Islamic State in Yemen. And they have these videos of these huge U.S. armored vehicles that are now either in control, again, of the jihadists or of the Houthis, which are the enemies, or the side that the U.S. is essentially waging against in this war. So those are two very important reports about why this war has been an absolute disaster. The U.S. made bombs are being used to commit countless war crimes, tearing the Yemeni children limb from limb, and then the U.S. made weapons that were transferring into that conflict or ending up into the hands of AQAP and the Houthis. The next couple of stories I have are from a couple of investigations that the Associated Press did in Yemen. The first one titled AP Investigations, U.S. Allies Al-Qaeda Battle Rebels in Yemen. And this report details how mostly the UAE has been working with Al-Qaeda fighters in Yemen. And that here we have them, right? That's because the coalition cut several deals with Al-Qaeda fighters, paying some to leave key cities and towns, letting others retreat with weapons, equipment, and wads of looted cash. An investigation by the AP found hundreds more were recruited to join the coalition itself. And so this is crazy. I think that last line is the real kicker. I mean, I guess it's one thing to say like, hey, Al-Qaeda, you got 24 hours to leave this town, and they leave. It's probably a good idea, to try to keep them from taking all the weapons and cash. But I mean, sometimes it's hard to take care of these guys without killing innocent people. But allowing hundreds more to be recruited into the coalition itself is extremely disturbing. This is saying that the U.S. is fighting on the same side as all these Al-Qaeda fighters in Yemen. That's the side of this war we're on. We have gone from fighting with the Houthis against Al-Qaeda in Yemen to fighting with Al-Qaeda in Yemen against the Houthis. The Houthis are not the enemies of the American people. The Iranians are not the enemies of the American people even. The Iranians don't even support the Houthis that much, though. This is an insurgent group. Groups like insurgencies do get outside funding. They do get some outside help. That is true. But the insurgency itself exists because of the occupation, the Saudi air war, the blockade against Yemen. That's why the Houthis have been able to fight and hold on so long, is because they've kind of had to fight this insurgent air war as they're in some ways also governing Yemen, right? But they're not a group that is just supported by Iran or controlled by Iran. And even Obama acknowledged this when he was president. And while the idea that the Houthis are tied to Iran and backed by Iran, I mean they've received some support from the Iranians. I think particularly in the form of like advising and cash and stuff like that. But they're again have been governing Yemen for quite a long time. They joined forces with the former president of Yemen, Salah, who brought most of his military with him. They had a lot of military equipment. Yemen had a whole bunch of Scud missiles that South Yemen had bought from the USSR many years ago, and North Korea many years ago. Right, all those missiles have been converted and used by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia in this war. But that's not, this being a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. It's a war of Saudi Arabia against the Houthis, against the people of Yemen. Sure, the Houthis get some support from Iran, but, nobody was calling the Houthis American bat. Oh, the American bat Houthis or anything like that when the U.S. was backing them against AQAP. Just all the double standards about who are the terrorists here and who's backing who and everything. Next story. In Yemen's secret prison, UAE tortures and U.S. interrogates. This is from June 22nd of 2017. It goes into how the UAE had a string of, I think, about 20 different sites in Yemen where they were interrogating people, claiming they were looking for Al-Qaeda militants. Who knows how many people were actually Houthi or who were, just innocent people. But one of the things that the UAE did in this torture program is have a grill in which the victim is tied to a spit like a roast and spun in circles of a fire. The AP found, and so they were cooking people. That's what they UAE was doing. The Americans, they say, were not involved in the torture, and they say, oh, we didn't know the torture was going on, but they were coordinating with the UAE about these torture prisons, and submitting like questions for the UAE to ask their torture victims. Again, this is the side that America's on this war, torturing Yemenis. It's also another kind of interesting point to the whole war in Yemen is that mostly what the U.S. is doing is supporting the Saudi fight against the Houthi. That's almost always it. But the U.S. does have a drone war going on there. In the very beginning of the Trump presidency, he carried out a raid in a village, and that was supposed to target AQAP. So we're also trying to wage war against him. By the way, that particular raid killed an 8-year-old American girl. And so lots of war crimes committed here in Yemen. And in fact, the war crimes are so serious. I have an article here from Middle East Eye. U.S. officials concerned by potential for war crime charges over Saudi Arabia arms sales, according to a report. Some officials have hired their own lawyers, to discuss fears of being arrested while traveling overseas due to the U.S. continued sale of weapons in Yemen. And so because, we had these examples in 2015, 2016, 2018, blowing up weddings, schools, farms. Martha Mundy calls this a food war because they've targeted like farms and silos and flocks of sheep and stuff like that. But particularly selling the weapons, it'd be one thing to sell somebody a gun, right? So you have a gun store, somebody comes into your gun store and says, I want a gun, and you give them a gun, and then like 2 years later, that person commits a crime with that gun, right? Okay. But you have somebody who you just saw on the news was wanted for murder and said he was going to murder 4 more people, right? And he comes into your gun store and says, man, I need a gun. And you say, here's a gun. Actually, I'll give you a sale on this gun, right? That way you could go kill some people with it. That's what the U.S. has been doing in Saudi Arabia this whole time. They know that the Saudis are using these bombs to commit war crimes, and yet we continue to help them anyways. The only thing I will say is that the U.S. did stop the mid-air refueling in 2018. I think part of this was the UAE finally was trained well enough by the U.S. to take over some of this, but there was some real push about, lessening the U.S. role here. The other thing that could really wrap up U.S. intelligence officials or other officials in this war is the intelligence and targeting assistance that we have given to Saudi Arabia. There's been countless times the U.S. has apparently given Saudi Arabia a list of humanitarian targets not to bomb, and it's almost like Saudi Arabia pits the list off those ties. They've bombed cholera centers. There's a cholera center with a big like crescent moon with a star on it, like the Red Cross of the Middle East, right, is like saying like, this is our cholera treatment facility. Saudi Arabia drops a bomb on it. That's what's been going on here. And so it's crazy that we have U.S. officials that are so concerned about this war that they're hiring lawyers to defend themselves in case they get arrested. And yet they're doing almost absolutely nothing to stop the war from happening. They're not interested in stopping the war crimes. They're not interested in saving Yemeni lives. They're just interested in covering their own ass. Speaking of the food war, I have the report here from Martha Mundy. She works at one of the institutes at Tufts University. The Strategic Coalition in the Yemen War, Aerial Bombardment, and Food War. If you want the details of how it's a food war, Martha Mundy goes through it here. A lot of what she is talking about are the things that I've already talked about on the show. The bombing of farm equipment, the bombing of flocks of sheep, the targeting of water treatment centers, cereal factories, essentially any way that the Yemeni people could thrive, Saudi Arabia has targeted with bombs. And so Martha Moody gets into all the details of that in this report. I'm not gonna cover it in length just because I feel like I've talked a lot about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen already. The UN says it's the worst crisis in 40 years. I guess one thing I should touch on is the issue of cholera, just because it is called the worst cholera epidemic in modern history. In some sense, that is true. But Claire Manera, I think of Doctors Without Borders, clarified on the Scott Horton show at some point that it's really an epidemic of waterborne illnesses because the Yemeni people cannot treat their drinking water because the Saudi Arabia, like with their blockade, deprives them of like chlorine tablets, and also with airstrikes has directly targeted water treatment facilities and stuff like that. Also, just constant airstrikes on civilian population destroys infrastructure, which means when you go to the tap and you turn on the water, it doesn't turn on or it doesn't come out clean, right? And so this is seriously going on in Yemen. And so, those factors combined with, when things flood, and Yemen was the poorest country in the Middle East prior to that. And so it's not like they had modern U.S. infrastructure to begin with, but all of those combined together means there's a hell of a lot of waterborne illnesses that cause extreme diarrhea and vomiting. And if you're unable to get to a center and get treatment, an influx of fluids and, monitoring until you've flushed it from your system, it could easily kill you. And so all that gets labeled as cholera, but not all that is necessarily actually cholera. And so I just wanted to go through that because people will go and say like, hey, it may not be the worst cholera epidemic, and they may technically be right. However, there is a massive amount of killing of innocent people, by them not having clean drinking water to consume. Now we're at a pretty good risk of a famine here in Yemen. This has been going on for quite a while. They say that there are parts of the Yemen that are in famine-like conditions now, and that's been the case for at least since 2019. It doesn't seem like it's getting any better. There's not a real good estimate on how many people have died in this war. One thing I'll recommend is to check out the work of Nasser Arabi, who's a Yemeni journalist who's been living in the capital city of Yemen, Sana'a, throughout this war, reporting on it and the destruction there. And you'll get a real good sense of what it's like to be in Yemen and to be on the receiving side of this war listening to Nasser. The last thing I have is probably the reason that this is urgent and why this needs to be undone now. And that is the U.S. in the last day of the Trump administration named the Houthi a terrorist group. There's some this argument could kind of be somewhat complex to what are the Houthis a terrorist group or not. I mean, I don't see them as being like a group. They seem to be the government of Yemen. I don't think they're necessarily a terrorist organization either, at least not in the way that the U.S. uses that word. In some ways, they're horrible bastards fighting a war, though, and especially because of the situation in Yemen where there's such indiscriminate bombing of the Yemeni population. A lot of the soldiers used by the Houthis aren't of an age that in the West we would consider is okay to go fight a war, right? So they'll label them as using child soldiers. And, in some way I think that the Houthi could probably do more to try to protect children here, but I mean, it's not my moral call in that point. This isn't something that my government or a group that my government is backing is doing. The Houthis use a lot of like landmines and stuff like that. Again, this is a terrible tactic because it's going to kill a lot of people for years to come. The problem is that the Houthis don't have an air force, and the Saudis do. And so I think the land mining is essentially the way that the Houthis are able to control territory that would be vulnerable to airstrikes. And it's essentially the kind of in a way that the Houthis aerial campaign or something like that to try to hold territory with these landmines. And it problematic, just like the way the airstrikes are, is that it's going to wrap up and kill a lot of civilians. But I really don't think that is correct to call the Houthis a terror group, especially since if the war against the people of Yemen end, right? And there's no more indiscriminate bombing of the Houthis. I mean, I don't know Yemen, but from what I've heard from Nasser Arabi and a lot of other people, it doesn't seem like there's a real reason to believe that the Houthis are going to turn around and start committing a genocide, that they're going to keep using child soldiers, that they're going to keep using indiscriminate landmines unless they're fighting a war. And so, unless there's some evidence that, the Houthis are going to be really, really terrible here, I don't see any reason to label them a terror group. The other problem about labeling them a terror group is the, implications it has with sanctions. So whether it's right or wrong that the Houthis are terrorists, it's probably it's a bad thing to label them a terrorist group because of the sanctions outcome. So it's going to make it really hard for any aid groups to do aid in northern Yemen. Again, this is 70% of the population. 22 groups within Yemen says they'll prevent them from being able to do the kind of aid work they need to do. The World Bank estimates 1 in 10 Yemenis rely on remittance to survive, which is money sent from other, people living overseas in other countries. That's going to all dry up if the Houthis are labeled a terrorist group because nobody's going to facilitate those money transfers. So I think this is and all the experts, not just what I think and what I've seen from watching Yemen, but the real experts on the issue say this is going to exacerbate and send Yemen into a full-scale famine, and we're going to see a horrific situation. The Biden administration is still dragging their feet. Oh, we need to assess this and see what's going on, see if it's going to help us end the conflict or whatever. They should just undo it. Biden undid Trump's Muslim travel ban on day one. People are like, oh, thank God we finally have a president who cares about Muslims again. And then, look at him still starving the Yemeni people to death, dragging his feet on making that decision. All right. I think that's about covers us in Yemen. I guess one of the things that you don't hear me talking about in this war is like changing battle lines. And that's largely because they haven't moved a whole lot. Since the Saudis have entered the war, they have been able to contest a port city called Hadada, and they have taken back some territory. And and point out in that AP article that I addressed earlier from AQAP and others, the Houthis have made some offensive against the Saudi bad side, but cities like Hadada remain contested, but in the hands of the Houthis. Cities like Taiz remain contested, but within the hands of the Saudi-backed government. And so the battle lines haven't changed very much in the war. It's been pretty much a stagnant conflict, despite the Saudis' overwhelming air power and all the support of the United States, and depriving the Yemeni people of so much. They haven't been able to make progress in winning this war, and it doesn't seem like they're going to anytime soon. So whatever happens with the Saudis, whatever happens with the Yemenis, it's time for the U.S. to end our support. A lot of people, a lot of experts have said that without the U.S. support, Saudi Arabia really couldn't wage this war anymore, or would have to really, really scale it back. They would have ran out of bombs several times over now if it wasn't for the U.S. support. And so, whether it ends the war or not, whether it stops the killing in Yemen or not, whether it puts food in the bellies of Yemeni children or not, the time has come for the U.S. to exit this conflict, simply because everything that we're doing is exacerbating all the worst things happening in Yemen. And even if our exit isn't the magic wand waving sunshine and rainbows over Yemen, it's unfortunate that we've done so much to destroy that country in the past 6 years. But that can't be undone, but we could stop aiding the destruction of that country now. So we have to demand an end to this. The Biden administration has signaled that, they're looking at, Antony Blinken said in short order, whatever the hell that means, 1 year, 2 year, 1 month, 1 week, that the U.S. would, end support for Saudi Arabia. What ending support for Saudi Arabia means, does that mean we're going to stop selling them bombs? Because that would be huge. But if it just means that we're not going to help them pit targets, or we're not going to help them repair their planes, or we're just going to be less militarily involved in Yemen, if we're still selling them bombs, we're still letting the Saudis wage this war. And so what the Biden policy looks like is unknown. It's been suggested by his administration that it's going to be better than the Trump one. That's great. Let's hope so. But we have to keep up pressure here. People often say Yemen can't wait, and that's absolutely true. There's children in Yemen that can't wait. That they will starve to death in the next couple of days. There's a lot of, probably for the next couple of months, even if the U.S. ended the war, the Saudis ended that war, they ended the blockade, aid ships start pulling in. There's so much infrastructure damage. There's so much violence that have been done. There's probably a lot of people that, are still going to die and suffer of starvation for the months to come. But we could start to curtail that now by ending the American involvement in that war. All right. That's the show for today. Thanks everybody for listening. I really hope, even, you don't have to retweet this show or whatever, but find some time to talk about Yemen a little bit, put it on people's radars. And we got to get some pressure on the Biden administration to end this damn thing. So I really appreciate people listening to the show, hearing what I have to say about. Hopefully I armed you up with some good facts and stuff to share with people, and get this thing over with. Support the show at Subscribestar. Share the show from YouTube, libertarianinstitute.org. And support the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde sells CBD products. I really enjoy the CBD products that I get from Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com. Use the promo code PEACE when you check out. And again, I really appreciate everybody for tuning in. I'll be back with another show on Wednesday.